Hey guys, good morning. Today is March 30th, so we are going to move forward into 9.5. We're going to look at trying to solve quadratic equations by completing the square. All right, so I put a warm-up on there today. Going to review perfect square trinomials, and that's what we're going to try to create, perfect square trinomials, so that we can take the square root of both sides. So let me walk through the process. All right, what we've done so far solving quadratics is whether the quadratic's a perfect square or not, we got it set equal to 0, and then we factored this guy. This guy ends up being x minus 8 times x minus 8, which happens to be a perfect square trinomial, which doesn't have to be that way to solve using this technique. I'm just using this as an example, equals 0. Then we use the zero product property. So x minus 8 equals 0, or x minus 8 equals 0. So we had x equals 8 to solve those. Okay, that was our 9.4. And a 9.5, what we're going to end up doing is completing the square. Again, I'm going to walk through this process in a second. But if we were to take the same problem, all right, if it's a perfect square trinomial, and we factored this guy to x minus 8 times x minus 8, or x minus 8 times itself, right, x minus 8 quantity squared equals 0. What we can do, the whole process here is we can now take the square root of both sides and solve it this way. And the square root and the square cancel each other out. You're left with x minus 8 equals 0. And by the way, this becomes plus or minus 0, but since 0, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative 0. We'd have that value, and you can see if we solve it, we get the same answer we did solving it using the other technique, our zero product property. So what we're going to do then is take quadratic equations, try to make them into perfect squares. That's why it's called completing a square. And then take the square root of both sides. All right, let me pause the video for a second. Okay, so what do we have? The process ends up being like basically a 5-step process. So let's say we have something like, and these are often notes that I took pictures of and put in there, x squared plus 10x minus 3 equals 0. Now what we're trying to do is solve this guy, right? We're trying to figure out what is x to make this true. Now if we remember, what this does is if I were to graph this quadratic, all right, what we're looking for is basically the values where y equals 0, right? So the x values where y equals 0, which would make my x-intercepts. And looking at Desmos real quick, and I'm going to type this in so you guys can see what's happening here. All right, if I type this guy in and found the zeros, we had y equals x squared plus 10x minus 3, x squared plus 10x, 0x, let's put 10 in there, and minus 3. You can see if I were to graph this, my zeros end up being here and here. And they would be our solutions, and we're going to show you how we get them. Let me put them back up again, here and here. Now, if I go to factor this guy, I'm like, what two numbers multiply to get -3 combined to get 10? I can't factor it. All right, so factoring, I can't solve through factoring. So what I'm going to do is complete the square. And what I do is I get a and b on this side of the equation, and I move that -3 to the other side. And what I'm trying to do is find a value here that I'm going to put on both sides that completes this square. So what am I going to add to both sides? And that value every single time ends up being the value that I want to put in there is b divided by 2 squared. So take b, which is 10, divide that by 2, I get 5, and square 5, I'll get 25. So I would add 25 to both sides. Okay, so what I just did was I took and I completed that square. So now if I factor this guy, and notice I did it to both sides, I added 25 to both sides. So if I factor this guy, now this over here becomes x plus 5 times x plus 5, or x plus 5 quantity squared, equals 3 plus 25 is 28. And this guy over here doesn't have to be a perfect square, okay, because now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. It's nice when it is, but it doesn't have to be. So if I take the square root of this side and the square root of this side, this square root and that square cancels. X plus 5 equals plus or minus. I grab my calculator and I take the square root of 28. Let's see here. There's my second function, square root of 28 equals, and you see I get 5.29, and I can round that. So plus or minus 5.29. So to get x by itself, I just now subtract 5 from both sides. So it becomes negative 5 if I move that over, plus or minus 5.29. And I got to figure out both of these solutions. So if I were to do the negatives, I'm going to get negative 10.29, or negative 5 plus 5.29 is 0.29. And they would be my two solutions. And looking at what we did on Desmos, notice what we have there. There's my positive 0.29, and there's my negative 10.29 as my solutions. Okay, now if it's not a perfect square, so you have 28's not, sometimes your textbook will leave your answer like this. They get that 5 to the other side, they'll put negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 28 and just leave it like that. Okay, right now we're going to estimate and get decimal answers if it's not a perfect square, but this is an okay answer as well. All right, so that's the process when we do this. Let me go through another example. And hopefully in the beginning here, we're going to keep it somewhat simple. There are a couple of rules for this. All right, so the rules here are a 5-step process. We want to get A and B on one side and get C to the other side now, unlike factoring. All right, we want to get A and B to the same side, C to the other. The A value has to be 1, and we're going to keep it pretty simple right now. We're going to keep it at 1 for the most part, but if it's not 1, we just divide everything by that value. Then we have to figure out what to add to both sides, and that's always going to be b divided by 2 squared. And then we're going to factor the left side. It should be a perfect square trinomial, and then take the square roots and solve. All right, so again, if I had an example like x squared minus, we'll say, it could be any value here, 12x, and let's say we have plus 2 equals 0. All right, so you can see this guy's not factorable. There aren't two numbers that multiply to get 2, combined to get negative 12. So I'm going to end up doing x squared minus 12x. Let's get 2 to the other side. And now I'm going to complete the square. So what am I going to add to both sides? Well, what I'm going to add to both sides is negative 12 divided by 2 squared, which ends up being negative 6 squared, or 36. And now I can factor this guy into a difference of squares, right? With two numbers multiply to get 36, combine to get negative 12 will be negative 6 and negative 6. Okay, we've just completed the square. Over here I'm going to get 34. Not a perfect square number, doesn't matter. I just take the square roots of both sides. The square root and the square cancel. X minus 6 equals, again, this is not a perfect square, so I'm going to end up getting plus or minus whatever the square root of 34 is. Square root 34, enter, is 5.83. And now I solve for x. X is going to equal 6 plus or minus 5.83. 6 plus 5.83 is going to be 11.83, or 6 minus 5.83 is going to be 0.17, I believe. Okay, and they would be my two roots. We're going to spend today and tomorrow at minimum on this, practicing completing a square. And what happens if, I guess before I send you guys off here, what happens if A isn't 1? And I'm not sure if you have any on your on your papers today with that, or what happens if B is odd, and they can become more challenging. What I'll do is I'll probably post another video. I'm going to have to do about 10 minutes now, so I'm going to stop this guy. I'll maybe give a couple more examples on another video if you need to view them. All right, so check it out. Go through the textbook. Use the process of completing a square. It's a really good technique to use, and it works every time to find our solutions or the zeros of the function. All right, so hopefully the video will be of some help. Again, you can Google it. Just Google completing the square videos. You'll probably find tons of stuff online to give you a hand. All right, we'll slow it down. We'll do today, again, tomorrow, and probably possibly into Wednesday, making sure we understand this process. All right, guys, good luck. Talk to you later.